If you're someone who wants to be a little bit more active and willing to put in a little bit of extra work with their property to help maximize the rental income, maybe you just want to make a little bit more, or maybe you can't afford it otherwise, then a short-term rental might be the right choice for you. On the other hand, if you're someone who owns multiple investment units and are adding to your portfolio, and maybe you don't want to do too much other than handing the keys off to your realtor and letting them handle it, then a long-term style rental might be a better option for you. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Airbnb or short-term rental versus long-term rentals. Which one's better? Stay tuned to find out. What's up everyone, my name is Fady Nakhla and I'm a local real estate agent here in Toronto, and for the last 6 years I've been helping people buy, sell, and invest in Toronto and in the GTA. So if you have any questions or want to dive deeper into the world of real estate investments here in the city, drop them in the comment section below. You can also reach out to me using the contact information in the description below and I'd be more than happy to help. Now let's get right into it. Before we start, let's take a little time to define the difference between a long-term and short-term rental. So a long-term rental is the traditional way of real estate investing. It's probably what most of you are already familiar with. It's when you go out and buy a property, find a tenant, someone who's going to live there, and you sign a lease for that person to stay there for an extended period of time, usually 1 or 2 years. And during the life of that lease, they're paying you a fixed amount every single month. Now for short-term rental, it's when you purchase that same property, but instead of having a tenant sign a long-term lease, you furnish it and you have guests who stay at your property for 1 night, 2 nights, maybe even a week at a time. Really anything under 28 days. And instead of having a fixed price, there's usually an average nightly rate that you can charge. So maybe on weekdays, you charge one price, on weekends, you charge a different price, but it's not one fixed number and it varies on the day and it varies by the season or if there's any events happening in the city nearby. Short-term rentals are usually marketed on sites like Airbnb, Vrbo, Expedia, but in Toronto, Airbnb is the main site. So for the sake of this video, I'll be using the term short-term rental and Airbnb interchangeably. So that's the difference between a long-term rental and a short-term rental. Okay, so now let's talk about which one is better. I'm gonna go through 5 major categories and we're gonna compare the two in every category. So there's income, cost, risk, passiveness or tenant management, and unit upkeep or cleanliness. Okay, so let's start with income. That's really the big one. It's really the main reason people are interested in or drawn to short-term rental. For this video, I'm gonna be using Toronto in most of my examples because that's the city that I'm most familiar with. You can definitely short-term rental really anywhere where there's a demand for it. I know vacation or cottage rentals up north or far east of Toronto also do really well, but really every area will have its own set of average numbers for income. So income-wise, long-term rentals are actually doing pretty good right now in Toronto in 2023. A 1-bedroom on average in the city rents for $2,500 a month, a 1+10 rents for around $2,800, and a 2-bedroom for around $3,400 a month. And those numbers will range sometimes depending on the unit, if it comes with parking or the size or location of the unit, but those are the average numbers. Now on the short-term rental or Airbnb side, you're looking at around $250 a night for a 1-bedroom, around $325 a night for a 1+10, and then $400 a night for a 2-bedroom. And I'm being pretty conservative with those numbers. Recently, I've seen a few clients with 2-bedroom units that are charging $500 to $600 a night, especially during big events like Canada Day or Caravana, or even during just regular weekends. Those numbers will usually shoot up around $100 to $200 more per night. Also for short-term rental in the city of Toronto, you're only allowed to Airbnb your units 180 days every calendar year. So for the sake of comparing these two types of rentals, we're going to compare the 12 months of the long-term rental to the 180 days of the short-term rental. So now let's compare these numbers side by side. So for the long-term rental, we said the 1-bedroom unit rents on average for $2,500 per month. So for 1 year, that would be $30,000. On the Airbnb side, a similar unit would rent nightly for $250 a night, and for 180 days per year, that would be $45,000. So there's a $15,000 difference there per year. A 1+10 rents on average for $2,800 a month. So for 1 year, that would be just under $34,000. A similar unit on Airbnb would be about $325 a night, and again, for 180 days in a year, that would be be $58,500. So there's about a $24,000 difference there. And then lastly, a 2-bedroom unit rents on average for around $3,400 a month, which would be about $41,000 for the year. And the same unit on Airbnb would be $400 a night. So for 180 days, that would be $72,000. The difference there would be $31,000. So the short-term rentals make more money than the long-term rentals while only being rented half the year through Airbnb, which is great because it's also great for the wear and tear of your unit. So in terms of gross income, short-term rental gets a point in this category. Now, we obviously haven't spoken about costs yet because that will impact your net income. So that's the next category that we're going to be comparing. So for this category, I'm only going to be comparing the costs that differ between the two rental types. There are some costs, obviously, that you will have regardless if you do long or short-term rentals. Costs such as land transfer tax when you buy the property, the annual property taxes, or even your monthly condo maintenance fees, if you're in a condo, are going to be there no matter what. So for a long-term rental, there are going to be minimal costs. There's really only one cost associated with a long-term rental that's sometimes overlooked is paying a realtor to help you find a tenant. Now, obviously, you can do this yourself, but most people will go through a realtor, especially if you're trying to find a quality tenant or don't have the time to look for one yourself. On the leasing side, you as a landlord have to pay both the listing agent and the buyer agent who represents the tenant when a lease is signed, if you do use a realtor. The standard amount for this is half a month's rent for each, so you lose 1 full month's rent when you sign on a tenant. Obviously, the longer the tenant stays, the better, because if they do leave after that 1 year, then you have to go through this process again and again, and you would lose essentially 1 month rent every time you do this. On the short-term rental side, there's definitely going to be a lot more cost, especially up front. So you firstly have to furnish the unit, which can range from $7,500 to $10,000 for a 1 to 2 bedroom unit. It also depends on the type of furniture that you buy or how nice you want the unit to be. Obviously, the nicer and more unique your unit is, the more you can usually charge per night. Then you have cleaning fees that you will pay a cleaner after every stay. Airbnb has a cleaning fee that you as a host can charge on top of your nightly rate, so you usually break even there, but these days cleaners are charging around $200 to $250 per night. I've had clients in the past who will clean the units themselves and then make a little bit more on that end and cut some costs, but if you do this, just be careful because really 1 or 2 bad reviews can really kill your listing, especially if you're just starting out. Then you're going to be paying the hydro bill, which is usually around $100 a month, also the internet bill, which is another $100 a month. So yes, the cost on the short-term rental side will definitely eat away at your income. One thing to note here is the furniture is a one-time cost, so the longer you operate, the better your return will be. Really, once you're past that first year, the furniture should be completely paid off. So cost-wise, we'll give long-term rental the point here. And that takes us to the third category, which is risk. Now, I'll start off by saying this. Long-term rentals are inherently less risky than short-term rentals. Short-term rentals are part of the travel industry. So if there's a big negative downturn in the economy where people stop traveling, just like what happened with COVID, then obviously most short-term rentals are going to be negatively impacted more than a traditional long-term rental will. With a long-term rental, you have a signed lease in place with your tenant that says they're going to be paying you X dollars per month every single month for the life of the lease. So the only time you have risk with a long-term rental that you wouldn't have for an Airbnb is if you have a tenant that doesn't pay. With Airbnb, you don't have to worry about tenants not paying rent because they're only staying for a few nights at a time, and Airbnb actually collects the money from them ahead of time before they're staying. Now, quick sidebar, I'm sure you've maybe seen the stories or heard in the news about, people sneaking into Airbnbs and trying to make it their home or having big parties, but that is a very, very, very rare exception. And I can almost guarantee that the number of evictions that happen in a short-term rental space are far, far fewer than what you see in a long-term rental space. So for short-term rental, as long as you find a quality tenant, then the risk with this type of rental is extremely low, right? I think we can all agree on that. The problem really comes up if your tenant starts causing problems. The landlord and tenant board here in Ontario is great if you're a tenant, it's awful if you're a landlord. I know many investors who have chosen not to invest here because of the off chance that they may have to deal with the landlord and tenant board if they end up with a problem tenant. Now, I'm not saying tenants are awful. 99% are fine. It's obviously that 1% that causes all the issues. And the real issue here is if you do end up with that 1 or 2% for a long-term rental, it is a nightmare to evict or get rid of this person, even if they're not paying you rent or even if they're damaging your unit. The board is always backed up, and that's not their fault, but it can take 6 months, 8 months, or even up to a year to evict this person. And even after that point, it's very likely that you will not be getting getting any money back for that time. Now, if you're a seasoned investor with 10 units, you may be able to handle that financially. It may not be the biggest issue, but for someone who is new to investments or just has that one investment property and is paying a mortgage on it, a year's worth of no rent in today's economy and current interest rates, that can break you and force you to default on your mortgage. With short-term rentals, you don't fall under the scope of the landlord and tenant board. If someone overstays their welcome in an Airbnb, they're considered trespassers. You can call the police and have that person removed immediately. So at the end of the day, are long-term rentals less risky? Yes, technically, but once you do run into problems, then it's really hard to get out. So I'd argue that they're pretty even on this one. So far, it looks like we're tied at 2-2. What do you guys think so far? Are you team long-term rental or short-term rental? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're into this kind of content, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you get notified when new content just like this is uploaded. Now let's get right back into it. The fourth category we're going to be comparing for these two rental types is unit upkeep or cleanliness. If you're doing a long-term rental, you may not see your unit for 1, 2, or 3 years, maybe even longer. Are the tenants cleaning it themselves? Are they cleaning it often? Are they hiring a professional cleaning service? Again, I'm not bad talking tenants. I know majority are great. I have many friends that are tenants and the units are in great condition, but at the end of the day, they don't own these units. And for many people, unfortunately, because it's a temporary living arrangement and they don't have that sense of ownership, then they may not treat it as if it's something that belongs to them. I'm not talking about big damage or units completely ruined or those types of one-off scenarios that you see on the news. I'm just talking about the state of the unit when the lease is over, and many times it's not that great. And there really is no penalty for it. Once your tenant moves out at the end of a long-term lease, it's pretty much impossible to go after them if there happens to be any issues. On the short-term rental side, yes, you do kind of face that same mentality from guests where it's temporary and there's no sense of ownership, but the plus side for Airbnb is that you have a professional cleaner going into your unit once or twice a week to make sure it stays in tip-top shape. So you really can have that peace of mind that your property is in good condition on a weekly basis. A lot of people seem to think because there's a high turnover of guests that there will be more wear and tear on the unit, and that's just not true. Maybe on the furniture, but even then, are the Airbnb guests really going to be using the bed, the couch, the coffee machine more than a long-term tenant who's in there every single day? I don't think so. A lot of these guests are here as tourists and only really in the unit to sleep. So I'd argue they're probably using it even less. On top of that, there's an actual rating system through Airbnb where owners can rate their guests after their stay, and it serves as more of a reason for guests to make sure that they keep everything clean. Now, is it 100% foolproof? No, but it's still something. So for this category, I'm going to give short-term rentals a point. The last category we're going to be talking about is passiveness. And what I mean by that is how hands-off is it to manage the rental. So on the long-term rental side, you're listing the unit either yourself or asking a realtor to list it for you. You'll receive tenant applications, which you'll go through and eventually pick one. The tenant will pay you first and last month's rent up front, and then usually give you 10 post-dated checks for the rest of the year. These days, a lot of people are also doing e-transfers, so that works as well. And that's pretty much it. In an ideal world, you won't really be speaking to the tenant for the remainder of the year unless there's any issues with the unit or one of the post-dated checks doesn't clear or they don't e-transfer you rent for a month. Now, on the short-term rental side, things are a little less passive, at least in the beginning. You have to start by furnishing the unit. Then you have to apply to the city for a short-term rental license to list your unit on Airbnb. Then from that point forward, you'll be receiving booking requests, which you have to accept or decline. Depending on how you'd like to run your Airbnb, you may be meeting guests to let them into your unit as well. So it's a lot more hands-on. However, there are a lot of things you can do to automate the process. On the Airbnb platform itself, you can set it to auto-accept guests who have used the platform before and have good reviews, so you don't need to worry about screening guests one by one. You can also set up automated messages for things like check-in or checkout or any frequently asked questions. For the actual check-in process, you can have automated door locks or keypads so that you can remotely let people in and out of your unit. Cleaners can sync up with your calendar so that you don't have to manually tell them every time you need a clean. Pricing-wise, there's many third-party sites that will set the prices for you based on the time of the year and the demand, so you shouldn't have to touch that too much either. So with all these things in place, outside of that initial setup and answering the odd question here and there, it can also be a really passive process. But for the sake of comparing the two directly, I think the long-term rental gets the point. So which is the better investment, long-term rental or short-term rental? Based on the final score, it looks like we actually have a tie. So I know this is not the answer you guys are looking for, but it's true, right? If you're someone who wants to be a little bit more active and willing to put in a little bit of extra work with their property to help maximize minimize the rental income because maybe you can't afford it otherwise, or maybe you just don't want the stress of possibly having to deal with the landlord and tenant board, then short-term rentals might be the right choice for you. This is only allowed in one unit as your primary residence in Toronto. So on the other side, if you're someone who owns multiple investment units and are adding to your portfolio, and maybe you don't want to do too much other than handing the keys off to your realtor and letting them handle it, then a long-term style rental might be better for you. And that's it, guys. Let me know what you think or your personal experiences with investment properties in the comment section below. In the long term, I'm talking 6, 7, 10 years down the line, regardless of the rental style that you choose, I think you're definitely in a safe spot when it comes to real estate investments here in Ontario. If you're thinking about purchasing an investment property here in Toronto or the GTA, whether it be long-term or short-term, you can reach out to me using the contact information in the description below, and I'd be more than happy to help. See you guys on the next one.